I really appreciate you all joining us for effectively managing conflict within the workplace caused by the COVID crisis. And I'm going to turn it over to our hosts, Michelle and Angelo. Michelle, the last time she hosted a TCI Talk, we were in at the bar in her office, and it wasn't the Florida bar. So things have changed a little bit since last summer, but we're thrilled to continue to be able to bring these talks to you, the topics that are important, topics from our leadership luncheon. So Michelle, please introduce yourself, and then I'll let you bring up Angelo, and Angelo, you'll just share your screen and we'll get started with our presentation. So thank you for hosting, and thank you both for leading.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lori. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Martinez Reyes. I work for Kelley Kronenbert. We're a multi-practice law firm. We have offices throughout Florida and satellite offices in Atlanta and in Chicago. Today, I brought one of my partners, Angelo, and I'm not going to even try to introduce him because his bio is quite extensive. But his area of practice is labor and employment. And the best part about him is that he has great government experience, which I think for most of us is sort of a mystery because that changes all the time and it's kind of sort of scary. So I think he has a lot of great topics to bring up, but I'm going to just comment on the breakout rooms and some of the common themes. What I'm starting to see here and in other organizations is that the biggest obstacles are really change, adaptability, and what is going to be, quote unquote, that new normal, which is such an overused term at this point in time. Whether it's how do we adapt overhead and where people work, how do people work? Is there a hybrid system? What's allowed versus what can I make people do? So I think Angelo kind of sort of fits well into that because a lot of us have a lot of questions, myself included. Just to say a little bit about myself, I'm 43. I have one son. He just started high school. He's been working here at home since March. You can imagine, for those of you that have children, dogs, cats, fill in the blank, somebody you have to take care of and have work and multiple partners all over the country to deal with, how difficult and stressful that can be. You know, I have to hard stop at 11:30 to do lunch because I'm the cafeteria lady. I have to hard stop for the break to give him what he needs to do. I have to hard stop for football to do the drop off. So I'm sure all of you have similar stories, whether it has to do with your staff. I obviously have my own staff I have to take care of, meetings, clients, pitches, all of the above. The other common theme I'm hearing is marketing. How do I market myself? How do I create market share? How do I adapt to a different type of customer? But I'll let Angelo talk a little bit more about the L&E stuff because I think for all of us, it's an area that we need to really get a hold of because all our lives are changing and will continue to change. And I think he's going to do a good job of sort of filling in some of those blanks. And then if you want to come back to some of the other everyday life themes, we can do that at the end, depending on how much time we have. So without further ado, welcome Angelo.
And again, let me remind you that Angelo would like this to be interactive. So as he goes through slides, questions, comments, let us know. And Angelo and Jess and I will be monitoring. You're on mute, Angelo.
Okay. Back on. Everybody hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so as Michelle mentioned, I am an attorney. My clients are in various different areas. I have clients in the hospitality industry, in the manufacturing industry, in the retail sales industry, and the construction industry. So it's a widespread group. I do employment and labor defense work. As Michelle mentioned, I have a lot of government experience, and actually that government experience is that I was regional counsel for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, way back in the 80s and 90s of the 1900s. I was actually there when the first case came out of the Supreme Court authorizing persons to bring sexual harassment claims. Believe it or not, before 1986, you could not even bring that as a claim. So it was an exciting time at the commission. I was there when the Americans with Disabilities Act was first enacted. I was there when the Family and Medical Leave Act was first enacted, although we didn't have enforcement authority there. But we brought a lot of very high-profile cases. I sued Publix way back when for sex discrimination. Had 100,000 claimants because Publix refused to bring women up into the area of management in each of their different facilities throughout the state. I think at the time that we brought the suit as the EEOC, there were 2 women who managed stores of the 535 stores Publix had at the time. And so, hopefully, the hope there was to make an impact, and I think we did. We sued Joe Stonecrab, one of the icons of South Florida, just to make an impact, also sex discrimination, because they wouldn't hire a woman to serve. Which was a pretty lucrative position, still is, in terms of monetary compensation. But there were a lot of exciting cases, particularly when the Disabilities Act came into effect. In '95, I joined Stearns Weaver as a defense attorney for employers, and I am now 15 years with Kelley Kronenbert as a defense attorney, handling anything dealing with the employer-employee relationship and also dealing with OSHA issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about OSHA at the end of this, but I wanted to start by saying, okay, what we're talking about this morning is managing conflict. And conflict typically caused by the COVID crisis is a result of stress. And stress, what does stress create? Stress creates anxiety. It could create depression. And those are words that are bandied about a lot, but what do they really mean? Stress, when I defend a lawsuit, in the prayer for relief, in the complaint, typically the employee is going to allege that because of their termination or failure to promote or whatever it may be, that they suffered from emotional harm. And then when I ask them in deposition what their emotional harm is, they typically say things like anxiety and depression. And then I ask them, okay, what do you mean by anxiety? What is anxiety? How has that manifested itself? How has that caused you physical impairment? How has that caused you impairments in your everyday life? And they really can't answer that question. It's a difficult question to answer. What is anxiety? It's a feeling we have, right? And what is depression? Well, it's a feeling we have. And both of those things, if you go to the psychological texts, will tell you that there's varying degrees. All of us get anxious about one thing or another. And we have that feeling, but it's hard to express that feeling. But it does manifest itself. And so the one thing I was going to start out with, that's my picture 10 years ago. One thing I was going to start out with is what the CDC, and the CDC has kind of been our focus mainstay in the employment field to determine what we need to look at in terms of managing our workplace during the COVID crisis, and how do we do that? And so the CDC sets forth work-related factors that cause stress. They also actually set forth behaviors. And we're going to talk a little bit about, as I go along, the behaviors that manifest themselves when stress results in anxiety or depression. But one of the manifestations is conflict in the workplace. And so we start out by talking about the CDC work-related factors that cause stress. And I think the top one is really the one that many of us, particularly in larger organizations, have experienced. The concern about the risk of being exposed to the virus at work. And that could manifest itself in many different ways. It could manifest itself in conflict between two employees, one of whom is perhaps not socially distancing or not wearing the mask the way they're supposed to wear or when they're supposed to wear it. Perhaps going around in the office and being social to try to bring themselves back into the fold, so to speak, and not socially distancing or not doing something or doing something that offends somebody else in terms of their view of what should be done within the office place. And so the risk there is that you have a conflict between either coworkers, or you can have a conflict between the employee and the employer. Why are you not enforcing this the way you should? I've had a number of complaints from clients where they tell me, well, not complaints, but questions, telling me, I've got numerous people walking in my office and saying, this one's doing that, and that one's doing this. And what I tell them is, well, send a manager out twice a day to walk around and determine whether or not people are in compliance with the rules that you've set out. The rules have to be followed. And so if you monitor your rules, you'll go a long way towards avoiding the conflict. Dealing with the complaints or conflict resolution, there are some important things to remember here, I think. And specifically when you have a complaint that's brought to you as the employer, how do you resolve that complaint? The one thing you should do, or the things that you should do first, is to deal with the complaint, not the person. Okay, address the conflict directly, as opposed to addressing what the person's views are. Ask them what their concerns are. Never treat this any complaint as some type of militant action. We're all very sensitive right now to people who are protesting about various things, and if someone comes to you as the employer and says, somebody's not doing this and I'm not happy about it, I'm going to take action or whatever, don't deal with it as a militant action. Deal with the complaint, the issue that's brought to you. Is it a policy issue? Is it something that you can address in terms of working together with the two people to try to address what their concerns are? Not looking at the person themselves, their personalities, whether they have anxiety, but simply dealing with the issue. Solutions that the employer should come up with should not be penalties. Don't issue discipline in situations like this. Communicate the expectations that you have as the employer to the employees as to what the rules are and how they should be followed. In addressing the conflict, make sure the two employees understand that what the rules are, and understand that in this situation, the expectation is that they will work together in following the rules and eliminating the conflict that they have between each other.
Angelo, do these rules, should these companies, regardless of size, have them written? Do they need to written distribute, have employees sign that they've received, or what's, you were talking about, we need to follow the rules. Well, what's the best way? Is verbal enough? Does it, what needs to be the medium of delivery?
The rules in terms of social distancing, in terms of wearing of masks, in terms of what sanitization, etc., should be set out in writing. They should be communicated. And in a subsequent slide, I think, but I'll mention it now, constant communication about the rules is important. Even though they're in writing, you need to verbally address rules with all of your employees on a continual basis, particularly if the rules are changed in any way, if there's a relaxation. For example, if many companies, including my own, right now are not allowing employees into the lunchroom because we don't want gatherings. And so perhaps at some point, that rule, if you have the same rule, will be relaxed. And so you'll allow people into the lunchroom, but you'll have certain rules about how they go into the lunchroom. And so the changing of the rules, it's very important to communicate. This is one area where, as we go along, you'll see communication is the key to reducing stressors. And again, as I said, stressors are what cause conflict. And the first stressor here being the risk. The next stressor that the CDC, and I kind of put these in order in which I think they present the greatest risks of creating conflict. The next one has to do with the taking care of personal and family needs. There are many employees out there who have issues with personal and family needs that create stress. And so how do we as an employer address that particular need? And I think one of the things that I've talked about with a lot of my clients is to be flexible. If in fact the particular family or personal need is not covered by the FFCRA, and that's the law that says that you can get family leave if you need to care for a child who doesn't have, who's not going to school or is not going to daycare, or who doesn't have some type of care available to them other than yourself, and you have work available, the FFCRA says you can get up to 12 weeks of leave at 2/3 of your pay, etc. But I'm talking about situations where that doesn't apply. And so if that doesn't apply, you need to address that in a way to try to resolve the anxiety or stress or depression, whatever it may be, that can occur as a result of that situation. And in doing that, the employer needs to be flexible, bottom line. I mean, because the employer is not trying to lose employees. I mean, employees are our commodity. And we've often trained them. They often have vast experience. They know our clients. You don't want to lose them. And so in this temporary situation that we have here with the COVID pandemic and the issues that arise as a result of that, you can, as an employer, to protect your commodities, be a little more flexible and deal with perhaps providing leave, and leave is tough because, you can't just say, okay, you can take off the next 10 weeks or 12 weeks until this is over. You need that employee. You need the productivity. You need the marketing, whatever it is that employee does. And so maybe you can say to the employee, all right, listen, why don't you work from home 2 or 3 days a week and then come into the office 2 days a week. in the hopes that that might alleviate the issue. Be creative in your flexibility and understanding that the personal and family needs is what's creating an issue or stressor to your employee, and trying to adopt a solution that'll work. Two caveats to the first two that I want to make sure you all understand from a legal standpoint. The first one is, if you have a number of employees, let's say you have 2 or 3 employees who approach you and say, you know, they're not going to work because they don't believe that sanitization issues are working. They don't believe that other people are wearing masks, or they heard that someone was infected, so we're not coming into work. You have to be careful in your actions towards those employees, because the National Labor Relations Act says that is concerted activity. Concerted activity is protected. They're not a union, obviously, but if they behave as a group, it just takes 2 or more employees to do this, their complaint is then considered concerted activity. And if you discipline them for not coming to work, that could potentially get you in trouble with the National Labor Relations Board if they follow.
Angelo, are those, you mentioned the family leave and then this, are those for, because everyone is mostly smaller business on the call. Is there when those laws are in effect, a certain size company, or are there thresholds or where that takes effect?
Right. The Family Medical Leave Act typically applies to employers of 50 or more employees. But the FFCRA, which was enacted to protect workers during the COVID crisis, requires only 1 employee. Okay. The National Labor Relations Act only requires 2 employees. Okay, so if you have 2 employees and they come to you and say, I'm not coming to work because you're not doing the right thing, don't discipline them. Treat it as a conflict and try conflict resolution techniques that I've been talking about: flexibility, addressing the conflict, and solutions that may work for them in order to alleviate that conflict. Remember, you know, a lot of what we're dealing with here in terms of reducing the risk in the workplace of COVID exposure, the failure to do that can get you into trouble. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. But suffice it to say that the only thing that I was talking about in terms of family medical leave would be the one enacted by Congress to protect employees, and that is any employee would be covered by that particular law.
Great, thank you for clarifying. Diana has her hand raised. Diana?
Yeah, a quick question. Let's say you have that scenario where 2 people, I haven't had that, but I'm curious to know. So 2 people say, I'm not feeling comfortable, the sanitary conditions are not what I think they need to be, I'm intimidated by getting COVID, yada, yada, yada. You have 2 people doing that, and will say, okay, don't come to work. Do you have to pay them?
No.
Okay.
No, and as I said, the thing you don't want to do is discipline them. So how you respond to that is you say, okay, well, you can take your vacation time. Most people don't want to burn their vacation time over this. Or you can take some unpaid leave.
Right.
Until we resolve the situation to your satisfaction. But here's what we're doing to resolve.
I think that would be a normal reaction anyway. You're not going to force someone to come to work unless it's like a...
No. Yeah. But then, you know, all right, so let's say they say, you know, their complaint is, well, I don't think you're purifying the air. You don't have proper air filters. And so, you know, we're being exposed. Okay, so in a week or 2, you say, okay, we've put the proper air filters, now come back to work and see what happens. And if they again refuse to come back to work and they don't give you a reason, then you can discipline them. Okay, because you've addressed their concern, you've attempted to accommodate the concern, and they're now being unreasonable. You need these people at work, or you need to replace them in order to fill a need within your organization. And at that point, once they become unreasonable, it's not a reasonable complaint anymore, then you can discipline them at that point. Okay.
Angelo, I have a
Right.
question. What happens when you have open workspaces? This has come up a lot with a lot of people asking me this. And the person now has to wear a mask all day, which obviously is very difficult to do if you have to wear a mask for 8 hours or whatever. How do you handle that? And that person either can't do that for a long time for a particular reason, or it's very difficult to do because they have to share. Sometimes small businesses or medium-sized business, have shared spaces or open workspaces or what have you. How do you deal with that?
Again, you have to be creative. I had a client come to me a couple of weeks back to say that they had an employee who had asthma. And because of the asthma, they could not, their doctor recommended against them wearing a mask. And so because the rule in that workplace was everybody wears a mask in the open spaces, then that person said, because they worked in an open space, I can't come to work. And so in that situation, I counseled the employer to explore different options. Okay, can we distance that person sufficiently to avoid risk to other employees? Can we isolate them? Can we put up protective shields around them? Again, we need to be creative. This is a difficult time for us in terms of protecting our employees. We want to protect our employees. And so there are a lot of resources available out there. CDC is a good one to determine what our options are to protect employees in those situations. And again, you want to resolve the conflict. You want to resolve the stressor. Because if you force the employee to work, obviously there's going to be a conflict between the employer and the employee. Or if you threaten the employee, okay, if you can't come to work, we're going to terminate you. We're going to replace you. You're welcome to apply again once this is all over. That's counterproductive, particularly where you have someone who you've invested in. And so the proper approach, in my view, is to try to come up with a creative solution whenever you have those types of issues. And there are a lot of different issues relating to that. It's a good question that I'm addressing on a day-to-day basis with employers who are trying to bring their people back to work. Okay, I've got to move a little quicker.
Yeah, and I have one more question here in chat that says CDC guidelines for workplace safety. Can you just say, well, it sounds like this isn't a good fit for you. Perhaps it's best that we go our separate ways and you can find work in an environment that's better suited for your new needs? Or can you be held liable for violating any laws? She said there's only so much additional investments you can make before you bleed out your cash and resources and the business folds. It's unrealistic to expect a full HVAC system overhaul, for example.
Right, understood. And that's legitimate business reason for taking some type of action in many cases. The risk that is inherent in that is if an employee comes and raises an issue or objects to something that they feel is unsafe, the risk is potentially a claim under the Florida Whistleblower Act or a claim under the Occupational and Safety Health Act retaliation clause. And so if I bring a complaint about safety and you retaliate against me by saying just go find another place to work, that might create a significant risk. And so that might be a legitimate business reason, but we have to approach it in a manner to avoid that risk. Okay, and so that involves counseling and a lot. And I've dealt with those issues, and we have put employees on administrative unpaid leave, and they change their tune after a while, or we put employees, on suspension and dealt with them. But if it's just a situation where you can't, as a matter of cost, comply, there may be other ways to comply. Okay, there are respirators, there are other things that would work, perhaps. Again, try to be creative. Try not to get into a situation where you're creating a risk of legal action against you. That's really the important thing from my perspective as an attorney representing clients and telling them how to deal with these issues. My first obligation is to avoid the lawsuit. Doing that, I counsel them to be creative and to be objective and to look at it and try to resolve the issue as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction in terminating the employee, which often leads to lawsuits. Okay, let's talk about managing a workload. The supervisors of your organization need to communicate their expectations. Define the tasks that you expect employees to perform, their responsibilities, and their expected results. We're not dealing with a situation where an employer is required to change productivity or targets or any performance goals of an employee. We're dealing with a situation where we're protecting employees from risk of contracting the disease. And so in managing the workplace, as long as the communication is clear, and again, going back to what I was saying before, a lot of this is communication. So the supervisors should not sit back and just expect the employees to do their work. They should communicate what their expectations are during this period. And again, the expectations do not have to be lowered. If you see an employee is struggling, okay, they're having a problem coping, they have anxiety, they have depression, and you know, again, the CDC defines behaviors. One of the behaviors is a drop in performance. That could indicate that that person is reacting to stress, and instead of lashing out with that employee, perhaps being creative, you can adjust assignments, redistribute assignments, make sure you're always acknowledging efforts, perhaps shift changes, start and finish times can be altered, because again, if they're having problems in adjusting their workplace life, particularly if they're working remotely and they have family issues or other issues that they need to take care of while they're home at work, they, you know, again, adjusting their schedule might help, adjusting their start and finish times, not focusing, you know, on the rigid things that we focus on when our employees are in the workplace. We focus on more people getting in on time and putting in their 8 hours, et cetera, when they're in the workplace. When they're not in the workplace, we can be more flexible. I can tell you that the studies show that when people are working remotely, they tend to work more hours than they do when they're at the office. They tend to feel like they are, they need to work longer hours. That goes to the last issue here, feelings that you're not contributing enough. I mean, the studies have shown that has resulted from this remote workplace plan that many employers have put into place. And as a result, that creates stress. And so, again, communicating to your employees that they don't need to put in that type of time. Unless they're not getting their work done, of course, but if they're getting their work done, or if they're doing more, to reduce stress, to reduce anxiety, to avoid conflict, talk to them about, you know, what hours they're putting in, whether or not you can make adjustments to their schedule to assist them when they're working remotely at home and have other obligations. And so that's a you know, means and manners to reduce stress. Lack of access to tools and equipment. Again, that's something that has occurred commonly with people working at home, that should be addressed in order to reduce stressors. Uncertainty about the future. Make sure that you are clear with employees about what their job security is, whether it's positive or negative. People who don't hear anything are going to tend to feel, well, I'm working at home, they don't really need me at the office. Maybe my job my job security is not what I thought it is. And so inform workers about their current situation and inform them about the company plans going forward. We're not going to have layoffs, or we are going to have layoffs. And this is how we're going to deal with the layoffs. And the layoffs are going to be temporary, or they might be permanent. But you want, if employees know what their situation is, they can adapt. Okay, if I know that there's a possibility of a layoff, and maybe I'm the last one in, so maybe I'll be the first one out, then I'm going to go start looking for other opportunities at this point. And so in and of itself reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty creates stress. And so even though, it's obvious that if I feel my job is in jeopardy, I'm going to be stressed in that regard, at least I know what I'm dealing with. And so it's important for employers, again, to communicate. Learning new communication tools. Here we are all on Zoom. I can tell you that I was not an expert on Zoom before all of this took place. I am now an expert on Zoom. I do depositions, I do court hearings, I do whatever, everything I can do, meeting with clients, etc., on Zoom and other platforms that my firm makes available to me to communicate with various groups. And so, they did that by training me. And so it's important that your employees who are still working remotely, or even maybe they're coming back into the office and they have some new tools, get some training and understand how to deal with the technical issues that have arisen as a result of this crisis. Adapting to a different workspace. Again, we're changing our workspace. We've all had a lot of time now, those of us who work remotely, to adapt to our remote workplace. But getting back to the office, there are going to be changes, okay? We're going to be socially distanced. We're going to perhaps be surrounded by plastic. We're going to have to wear masks in open spaces. We have to adapt. And you need to give your employees time to adapt, okay? And so, and again, communication in adapting and how to deal with the new workplace is important. And again, that a lot of that deals with communication. Okay. All right. So this was what a cute little cartoon. Again, I'm talking about our supervisors. How do I tell them I haven't a clue where we're going? Your supervisors are the key here. They need to be able to communicate with the workplace as to what to expect, how to do, what they expect, what's going to happen going forward. If it's not, management telling them, what we're doing, or executive telling them what to do, the first line supervisor is the one who should be telling them what to do. And so they should be modeling healthy behavior. What do I do to alleviate stress? Do I have a daily routine? Do I take breaks? Do I spend time outdoors? Do I meditate? I personally have found meditation helpful. I'm sitting in my living room day in and day out for the last several months. It's getting monotonous here. And so, how do you deal with that? And there are various ways to deal with that. And the supervisor or manager should model their behavior in terms of telling employees what they can do to alleviate stress and avoid conflict. Culture of connection, okay? Schedule regular meetings, ask employees what type of support they need. And I emphasize that a little bit because a lot of times what the response is from an employee as to what support they need clues us in as to what their stressors are. Okay, so again, in order to avoid conflict, ask questions. Okay, how you doing is not enough. You know, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis? How is it working out at home? Or how is it working out once you've come back to the office? Is there anything you need? Are there any technology issues? Are there any issues with respect to support that the company is providing you, et cetera, to try to obtain from the employee information that could assist you in reducing their stress level. Offer flexibility and be inclusive. You know, I talked a little bit about what flexibility is in terms of schedules, leave, et cetera. What I mean by inclusive is those of us in the HR world know that if we treat people differently, we create risk. And so you may treat one person a little different than another because you think their situation is such that what you give them is proper. But the moment you treat two people differently in a similar situation, you run the risk of what's called a disparate treatment claim. For those of us in the HR world, we know that could create an EEO complaint. And so we have to avoid that risk by being inclusive, and being inclusive means trying to treat everyone the same who are in similar circumstances. So if we are offering some flexibility with one individual, when the next individual comes and seeks the same type of flexibility, we have to look to the circumstances, and if it's a similar circumstance, then we have to treat it the same way to avoid risk. The last one is one that I can't stress more. You need to communicate. This is a situation where lack of communication creates stress. Lack of communication creates circumstances in which you potentially assist in creating conflict between employees or between the employee and their coworkers. You need to accept that different people cope differently with this type of situation that we're in now. And so in understanding that, the more you communicate, the more you problem solve with respect to individuals within your supervision, it lowers the stress level, particularly if you're being constructive and particularly if you're being flexible with the understanding that flexibility is because of the situation, and the employer is willing to work with you to alleviate concerns or problems or issues that you may have in various areas of the workplace. And again, communicating what the company's plans are, communicating how we're going to deal with return to work is important so that employees' expectation levels are there. Communicating what your performance expectation levels are. Again, that reduces stress. The employee understands what they're supposed to be doing. And so in that situation, again, communicate more than you think you need to. It is extremely important. Okay, so now let's talk about what are our challenges in returning to work.
Angelo, we had Linda asked if that says great tips, thanks. Is it possible to get a copy of your slides so I can share them with my management team?
Absolutely. We'll get those to you.
Right.
And then you can distribute them. I think, I'm hoping people take notes because I'm giving a lot more than what I have on the slides. Certainly, if they want to call me and discuss any of these issues in more detail, I'm perfectly willing to do that for the organization. The slides are fine.
Thank
So
you, Angelo.
what do I mean by transparency? I want employers, and I'm getting a lot of issues from my clients about, employees are coming to us and they feel like they don't know what's going on. And so that gets back to the communication, but your communication needs to give a perception of transparency. What is the decision-making process? Make sure that your employees understand what your timelines are in terms of return to work, in terms of what to expect when they return to work. You may want to get feedback from perhaps you can establish maybe a management employee committee that will provide feedback on the exposure control plan of the company. And again, to get back to the point before, all of this the exposure control plan should be in writing. It should be communicated in writing to employees multiple times, particularly if there's a change. If possible, if within your organization, you should try to get some feedback. Maybe instead of a committee, maybe a hotline where employees can anonymously express the concerns they have, or a survey. A lot of HR professionals use surveys, and they're a good tool to determine what the concerns are within the workplace, particularly with respect to return to work. I think it's important that you understand what the concerns are before you bring back your entire organization, and then all of a sudden have to be dealing with multiple complaints. We want to avoid the stressors before they return, because once they return, they see things happening. Oh, that one's not wearing a mask, or the mask is below their nose, or that one's doing this, and then then HR gets overwhelmed. So what we want to do is we want to be transparent. We want to get input and feedback. One of the things in terms of stressors you want to do is to increase the visibility, if you have one, of an EAP program or other resources, and the CDC is a good place to find these resources for employees to if they do feel overly stressed, if they're overly anxious, if they feel depressed, to get help, to get counseling. And so as a measure of transparency, as a measure of communication, let them know what's available to them. And if you do have an EAP program, stress that to them multiple times. That's actually something that the firm has done with us. I mean, our HR director is great. She tells us these things time and time again. And I've seen probably 5 or 6 emails that talk about the EAP program. Consider a peer support program. That's a little more difficult for a small workplace, but again, it's another option. Communicate all of the things you're doing. Testing. Are we testing? Are we, we're requiring people to go out and test under certain circumstances. Are we doing a temperature test when we walk in? We know that the EEOC has said that temperature testing is fine. Requiring people to go out and test is fine. If someone has traveled recently and they need to be quarantined, that's fine. Air filtering, distancing, and your leave and compensation policy should all become part of your transparency and bringing them back. Educate, this is, important, particularly for your supervisors, to educate them on what the common symptoms are of mental health issues, in particular stress and anxiety. And again, the CDC is a good source of the types of behaviors. I mentioned one, the precipitous drop in performance has always been something that we look at as employers to determine if someone is not coping or perhaps is having a problem. But there are other behaviors, one of which is continual conflict with coworkers. And so, if that's something that's being observed, not just the conflict between one coworker or another where they, one's not wearing, the mask properly and someone goes to complain. I'm talking about someone who has multiple conflicts with multiple coworkers about various issues, or perhaps has isolated themselves from their coworkers for no good reason. There are things that you can look at, and again, the CDC is a good source to determine whether or not that person is exhibiting signs of stress or anxiety. Once they exhibit those signs, deal with them, because remember what I said in the beginning, stress or anxiety leads to conflict. And so we need to reduce those, or to take affirmative action with respect to those when we see those behaviors. Train your supervisors on conflict resolution. Okay, there's a lot of good resource material out there in the HR world about how to deal with conflict resolution. They need to, particularly when they see individuals with anxiety or perhaps who appear depressed, and they have certain there are certain stigmas and myths and stereotypes about a person who is anxious or depressed. And so we need to educate our supervisors to avoid those stereotypes or stigmas that are incumbent with those particular issues. The person perhaps has even been diagnosed and has an impairment relating to depression or anxiety. And in those situations, it's important for us to understand, as your supervisors to understand what that means and how to deal with it. And so they should be trained on how to deal with it. Prepare your managers to lead by example. Train them on, again, conflict resolution. Train them on active listening. Okay. A lot of the problems our managers and supervisors have that I see that lead to risk in the workplace, that lead to conflict in the workplace, is that they don't know how to listen. They don't know how to stop talking at their employees. They have to listen to determine what the issues are. And there are training techniques that are available that will allow them to learn that behavior. One of the interesting things that both within the firm when I'm dealing with issues or outside the firm when I'm dealing with clients, they always seem to be startled by the amount of time that I don't talk because I'm listening. Okay, and I let them talk, and I do the same thing in depositions. People hate silence, and so they need to fill that space by talking, and that's a tool that attorneys use. But if they're not listening, then that tool is worthless. So don't feel the need to fill the space. Let the employee talk. They will do so. Ask a general question and listen. And so your employers, your supervisors rather, need to understand that those techniques. There are others, but I'm just mentioning one in particular that is helpful in understanding where perhaps the stress is coming from and how to deal with it, how to avoid conflict. There may be situations here where we may need to adjust our expectations temporarily. If you have that flexibility, that's a way to reduce stress. Make sure that your supervisors are creating a safe space for discussions. Don't walk into an employee's office and without a mask and start, jabbering at them about what they didn't do the day before because you're upset. Understand what our situation is now and make sure you're modeling the behavior as a supervisor, and you go in and deal with the issue in an appropriate manner to avoid the conflict, to avoid the stress, particularly as we're dealing with return to work issues. Policy issues. One of the main policy issues here that we're going to have as we return to work are people who don't want to return to work, who want to remain in the remote workplace, and they're going to, and I've seen this already, they're going to give you 1,000,001 reasons why they should. They got a doctor's note is the most common one. They are in a risk area. They're of a certain age, or they have certain medical conditions that require them to stay at home remotely and work remotely. That may be or may not be feasible. I think in a situation where you have a clear case, you might want to consider some flexibility. But if we're returning our people to the workplace, the mandate needs to be everyone comes back. And in that situation, if you don't have a policy, you should create one, that says something to the effect that the organization will support remote work under appropriate circumstances. And we're not going to try to identify the situations that will do that. Because we're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis. You may want to provide one or two examples, such as if you have a pulmonary condition and a doctor's note that says that you absolutely cannot be exposed. Now, the response to that is well, this is everything we've done to avoid exposure. We've done everything that OSHA says. We've done everything the CDC says. We've gone above and beyond that. And so you are safe here. And so, as an organization, you have to make a decision. You may create that policy or you may not. You may require everyone to come back to work. And that's perfectly fine if you've created a safe workplace. Then people who refuse to come back to work, you will deal with them, in terms of perhaps telling them that they're on administrative leave, or they can take vacation time, but at some point they need to come back to work. Now, the question I get asked invariably is well, what about the person who has a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act? And therefore, I, as an employer, have a responsibility to accommodate that person. And so that's a very complicated issue that you take, again, on a case-by-case basis. If it creates an undue hardship on the employer to accommodate, then you don't have to make the accommodation. But if the individual does have a disability that creates risk of them contracting COVID, no matter how good you are, you may have to consider an accommodation of working remotely. But again, the ADA issue and accommodation issue is a complex one, and my advice is to consult with counsel before you make any decisions in that arena, because you could create risk. Another policy issue is that you should incorporate a mental health into your paid leave policies. So if you have a sick leave policy or a PTO policy, you're going to include both physical and mental impairments as giving them the right to take their sick leave or their PTO. Establish a policy for conflict resolution. You know, you may want to put in your policy handbook that you're going to investigate and review the circumstances when a conflict involves inappropriate behaviors or safety issues. Okay, and so you know, if it's just a spat, you don't have to do a full investigation. But if it becomes a situation where inappropriate behaviors are exhibited, insubordination or violence in the workplace, and I include violence to be anything ranging from physical violence down to threats, down to people getting in each other's face. There are a lot of things that can, and if you have a policy on violence in the workplace, that should include all of those things. But nevertheless, you know, if it involves safety issues or violence issues or inappropriate behaviors, then a full investigation will be conducted, and we'll make a recommendation to resolve the issue and take appropriate remedial action. And I'm looking over and reading because I carefully crafted the language. If you want that language from me, I'm more than happy to provide it to you. But when I'm talking about policy issues, I'm not going to go off the just off the cuff like I normally do. But I craft something that is appropriate in the circumstances to reduce risk. Okay. I think I'm on time. This is the latest from the EEOC, my former agency. It has to do with accommodation. And this has to do with if you're bringing people back to work, you can give them notice if they think they were needing accommodation, that they can do, you know, and then the following things can be included in the notice, okay? Include the CDC medical conditions that create risk. And you can write to the CDC website and get those. Who they should contact for an accommodation issue. Okay. And suggest or tell them that the request will be handled on a case-by-case basis. Okay. So that's what the EEOC says. You should put in a notice to returning employees who are seeking an accommodation. The reason and the EEOC has done several other things, but I wanted to focus on this one because I think it's important for employers to do this, because again, it's going to, if employers let you know beforehand, and this is, again, it says prior to the return to work date. So you can do it right now if your people aren't back, so that you know and can address accommodation issues before the employees actually come back to work and reduce your risk. Okay, and again, the accommodation issues are complicated and need to be dealt with carefully, but you want to deal with them before as opposed to after. Department of Labor deals with various different issues, and so I put some issues in here that I've seen recently. This has to do with the FFCRA. I don't know if you have any of those issues, but with respect to each of those 5 or 6 different things that will qualify for paid sick leave, there's a work availability requirement. And if you remove that to avoid the paid sick leave, that's considered retaliation. Okay, no, that's a legal mumbo jumbo, but in simpler terms, what that means is, you know, if you do something that if they were qualified for paid sick leave and then you do something that disqualifies them, that will be considered retaliation by the Department of Labor. Okay, it reaffirms that you have to consent to intermittent leave. If you don't want to consent, you don't have to. Okay, intermittent leave means instead of me taking the whole week off, I'm taking 1 day a week off. Perhaps I'm taking Mondays and Fridays off. Wouldn't consent to that because obviously they're doing it for a reason other than what they claim. Maybe they're claiming they have childcare reasons and they need, you know, one spouse is going to take Monday and Wednesday, and the other spouse is going to take Tuesday and Thursday, and alternate Fridays. And so you may, in that situation, consent to intermittent leave. But all this is telling us now, their guidance on September 11th is that consent under all circumstances is with the employer. Exempt employees may temporarily perform non-exempt duties. Okay, so if you have an exempt employee, under normal rules, and exempt employees are those who are salaried, who don't have overtime. If they're exempt, it's determined by the duties that they perform, not by the fact that you pay them a salary. And so they can now perform non-exempt duties without losing that status on a temporary basis. Because typically, if you have an exempt employee and you have them sweep the floors or do something which would be non-exempt type work, they would lose the exemption. Okay, and so in this situation, the Department of Labor says if it's temporary, they won't lose the exemption. Department of Labor also says, and this is the wage hour division, that you don't have to pay employees for time that they're taking for their personal or family obligations. So if, for example, I start work at 8 o'clock, I work till noon, and then I spend the next 2 hours working with my child on their online school activities, that 2 hours need not be paid, even though it's within their regular workday. Okay, so that's the Department of Labor guidance, most recent guidance. And then OSHA has started issuing COVID-19 citations for exposing employees to hazards. And there's two ways they do this. If they feel you're not complying with CDC guidelines or their guidelines, and they have their own guidelines on protecting workers in the workplace, if they feel you're not complying, they're going to issue what they call a general duty clause violation. And a general duty clause violation, if it's serious, can create a fine up to $13,000. They can add a training issue or another $13,000, et cetera, et cetera. Or they can issue a fine for failure to give employees or provide employees PPE. The OSHA standards require employers to provide at their cost PPE. So we should be providing our employees with their masks. They could bring their own, and that's fine, but that has to be on a voluntary basis. If you're not monitoring your employees and they're not regularly wearing their masks, and we're just not we're being lax about our rules for a safe workplace, they can issue a citation. And so that's a new risk. The citations that they've issued just came out in a news brief from them this week, which means they're becoming active, and they will likely become more active as the return to work comes into play. And so that, I believe, is it. Oop. Yes. Okay. So any other questions?
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we have people that need to drop off for us. So I just launched a poll just asking how we did today, so that we know if we're hitting the mark and offering the right topics and the right information. And that was incredible. And Angelo, I think we could have gone on all day long.